Welcome to our new edition of Mystic-Skeptic Radio. Today, we are taking a break from our regular broadcast in which we discuss genealogy, history, and persecution, and we will be discussing current events and what's been going on lately in the news. Our co-host is Joe Balog. Welcome to Mystic-Skeptic Radio. We've been doing this for the last 7 to 8 years, and it's been going straight to the subject kind of show. We don't talk much about ourselves or the impetus for having this program, but as I've been discussing to one of our biggest supporters, Joe Balog, throughout the years, there's so many things to discuss. There's so many deep subjects to address, and we only hear like a surface level introduction or discussion about what's going on in the world at this time. So, Joe, people know that I'm from Mexico. I'm very outspoken about certain views, and we tackle every single subject under the sun on the show. So we've been kind of scattered brain when it comes down to our topics, but when it comes down to issues that are going on in the world that need to be looked at deeply, I hope that our audience trusts me right now that we have an interest in the well-being of the world, and we want to help people think through the repercussions of some of the actions of the players, political and other kinds, in the world. So I asked Joe and his friend Grant to share a little bit about themselves. And the reason that I think it's important for the audience to get to know us is that the more they get to know you, the more they trust you and they believe in what you're saying. I'll bring up why this is important in a minute, but if you can just do like a elevator pitch on who are you and what's your deal. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, David, always good. I've been on your show like a dozen times or so in the last 5 or 6 years, and always good. But yeah, I'm just a guy from Traverse City. I am from Michigan. I went to college at Aquinas in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I moved back here 3 years ago. After traveling around, I lived in Mexico for about a year. I've been to Kenya for a month. I've done a lot of nonprofit work. I worked in Chicago in nonprofits, working with middle school students. I lived in a monastery for a year, and you and I have talked about that a lot on the show, and also about living on the farm and studying permaculture. And so recently I moved back to Grand Rapids and have been building a life here. And I'm an Orthodox Christian, so I go to an Antiochian church and converted from Roman Catholicism. I was evangelical for a while too. And I'm in the data world, so I've been a data technician and an analyst, and now I'm a data engineer at a corporation in Grand Rapids. And very fortunate to have a very good job and have very good friends that live here. But I'd say, like, on your show, I'm mostly trying to be the reasonable guy and giving like a differing opinion from yours, especially considering some differences we have in our background culturally and religiously. So
that's a hell of a dating profile, man.
yeah, it's very lengthy.
You're gonna get a lot of hits.
All right, great. This is why I'm on your show, David, to get a lady. This is
he's available.
Yeah, heads up.
Single and ready to mingle. Okay, what about you, Grant? You don't have to go in that much detail, like homeboy telling you his whole life story.
Yeah, well, I wish I could. I totally would, but yeah, I'm mine's a little bit quicker. I'm also grew up in Traverse City, actually just down the street from Joe, and just a metal worker. That's all I've ever been doing. Just working with metal. So
well, you can be our bouncing board or the sounding board to as we bring up these subjects, because my name is David Daniel Gonzalez. I'm the host of the show, and the reason that we started doing the show is because where Joe and I used to live at the Farm Intentional Community, there was a lot of talk about progressive ideas. There was a lot of talk about conspiracy theories. There was a lot of very clever perspectives that were being brought to the forefront. But I felt that we needed to discuss them to their logical conclusion. And I've gone back and forth from being conservative to liberal to in between. And I keep being disappointed with everyone. And I keep feeling that I'm being played with because there's so much, like, it's almost like we live in a world full of advertisement and propaganda. And you only get half of the story that makes that particular individual look good. And then the rest gets shoved under the rug and everything's going to be all right. Just follow me kind of stuff. And as spiritual folks, we believe that the blind cannot follow the blind. If you're limited in your understanding, if you don't have enough information, and then you have some prankster who's trying to take advantage of you, it's a recipe for disaster. So the more information, the more we communicate, the more free speech and investigation that we do on subjects, the more we can come to with a clearer picture of what's going on. So the first topic I'm going to throw to you guys is something that that I've been chewing on for a while, and it's the end of journalism in American society. I took journalism classes in my communications degree, and they talked about being unbiased. They talked about being objective. And what you notice in all different media is that nobody is capable of doing that because they have not only an agenda, but a problem of access. So if you get Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, or someone from the Biden administration, including the president, on your show, you're only allowed to ask certain questions. You're only allowed to bring the conversation to a certain path, or they shut you down, they blackball you, they dismiss you from the press corps, and you're out. So in a very subtle and manipulative way, the media has become a mouthpiece for the government or for particular officials, because if they do anything that upsets them, they lose access and the ability to get their perspective or use them as a platform to be able to get more clicks and more people to watch their show. So instead of being completely anti-journalists like they're in Mexico, where they kill the journalists that speak ill of the government, of the gangs, of the people in power, here they force them to comply and fall in line. And I think that's worse, because you don't know who your enemy is. You're trapped in this sounding box where you can only say what resonates with them, and then you're keeping people ignorant. What do you guys think? Joe, you who have traveled, do you think that the system has become so corrupt that there's really no more journalism and no ability to challenge the powerful and to bring out to the forefront things that are harmful to society?
Probably not. There's some people who are still genuinely doing it, right? But it's just perhaps more difficult to find. And I don't know any real journalists, so I don't really have any anecdotes to share from that angle, or any like deeper insight about what the industry is going through. I would say maybe that is one thing, is like, it's very interesting. And I've thought about this a lot in data and like working in manufacturing and stuff. Like it's very different when you're inside of an industry and talking about what's going on and these sort of insights and information that you have versus outside. So like even the state of journalism is going to have a different conversation whether you're working at Fox News or you're just reading Fox News. And I think that's like a big piece of it. The travel piece, I think, is interesting, right? Like different, I lived in Mexico for a little bit, so like you definitely get the sense that people are generally distrustful of the news that they read, except for the fact that it is true, like the violence is all real, the drug stuff is all real, but they're not being told actually what's happening in their government. Same thing with Kenya. And Kenya, for, you know, it's just more like tribal. So like that influences a lot of the media. and they know, like, if you're from a certain tribe, you're going to read these types of newspapers. But I think in the States, like, it's difficult. It's much more difficult to parse out like what's really good and what's not. I think people tend to like find personalities that they like and just to follow them.
How about
Yeah.
you, Grant, as someone who just take care of your family and doing what's good for your livelihood? Do you feel like why even waste your time reading or listening to stuff if it doesn't benefit you? Why even bother? Or are you open to hearing everybody's perspective?
No, the way I always kind of view stuff is you really need to see. I mean, I kind of agree that, I mean, there's so much bias in all of our major media, especially, but you kind of need to see all sides of it, because if you start just only watching whatever one news network or reading one paper or whatever, I mean, that's dangerous. And then you get whole communities doing that, and then it's just like burying your head in the sand type of thing. So I think you need to be able to read or see news from all sorts of, or whatever, journalism or reporting or whatever, from all sorts of different angles, and be able to kind of see what is BS and what actually isn't total BS. But I mean, the US, I think it's really hard at this point. I think one of the things I look for when I'm looking to see what's up in the news or something is looking at people or journalists that can ask critical questions, and like they've, they're not there's no financial benefit to some major news corporation or whatever, and they can be more critical about stuff and ask tougher questions and have more real conversations.
But how can you survive in modern state of affairs without a financial component? Like even back in the days when all you had was print, you needed to put ads to be able to create the newspaper. So if the guy that sells shoes doesn't like a certain candidate, then next thing you know, you're going to be writing something that is favorable to the guy that you're trying to sell the ad to. So isn't capitalism the problem? Like if there was no need to have sponsors for the media, then they would be more free to speak on any subject. But I've noticed even in NPR and KPFT here in Houston, which is a Pacifica station, another nonprofit, or they say listener supported radio. They only run stuff that makes their listeners happy. So if a conservative person comes in and starts talking about something they don't agree, they'll boot them out because they're paying for liberal media. And National Public Radio is the same thing. At one point, it was so bad, the democratic influence of what they were saying. They had a guy from the New York Times trying to knock Bernie out of the race, that I called the FCC and I said, this is just a commercial for the candidate they like, and they're trying to blackball Bernie because he doesn't support their agenda. How can you let this be considered public radio and community sponsored or government sponsored when it's so clearly biased? And the lady told me, well, you're the first one to complain. If we get enough complaints, we'll investigate. So I almost needed to have an army of callers to get them to look into how ridiculously biased it was. So what's bringing about this discussion is the horrendous interview with that Jon Stewart in his new Apple show did with Condolessa Rice and Hillary Clinton. And the people who have been criticizing how softball and non-confrontational he was during the questioning have not addressed that he most likely is a big financial supporter of both regimes, maybe not the Bush one, but at least the Clinton / Obama, and maybe even the Biden one. So now that he's a donor, he's not gonna shoot himself in the foot and get into a fight with Clinton on his show, because then he loses influence, and maybe he has become with time more like hoping to do a little by little change instead of radical quick change. So he cannot be so poignant that he alienates his guests. So he has to kind of maneuver through the BS and propaganda that they were putting out, but it really makes him look unable to challenge them, and almost like part of the problem. Were you guys ever followers of Jon Stewart, and did you ever think that he was doing a good job at bringing up issues in government when he was running the Daily Show?
It's interesting you bring up Jon Stewart. I'm actually a really big fan of Jon Stewart, but I've seen that episode, or I haven't heard that episode yet, but I saw that Hillary Clinton was on there, and I thought that was kind of weird. I just saw like the couple of clips, that were shown on, like, I think Instagram or whatever, and it seemed weird in the short, it's several seconds of the interaction, but it seemed like he wasn't being very critical with her about stuff. Not in the way he usually seems to be with a lot of people he's interviewed. So I guess I'm curious to see that episode now at this point. But yeah, I don't know. I think he usually does a pretty good job about being pretty objective about things. And I mean, he's done a lot of other good things, like the was the PACT Act recently. He's helped out with that. He helped try to get first responders for 9/11 healthcare, and that was like an 18-year process. And he kind of came in at the end, and I mean, he kind of made a bunch of comments. He's like, "Why is it got to take a celebrity person to get healthcare for first responders at 9/11?" And same type of thing can happen with the PACT Act. It's much quicker, but yeah, interesting. I actually, yes, like I said, I am a big fan of Jon Stewart. But everyone has a bias. That's just kind of the unfortunate thing to it. And I don't know if it's just like everyone wants to believe, the confirmation bias element to it or whatever, but I don't know. Interesting. Do you follow him?
Mm-hmm. No, I didn't follow him, but I liked him. I mean, I think he's a good TV persona. What he does, outside of that, like Grant was saying, is probably big, but it's like you're part of, he has a job, and so he has to get paid and all of this, and he's part of a network, and they have to get paid. And so you could go back and be like, well, it's capitalism, but capitalism is the very reason why we're even watching the show in the first place. So you can't fight against that on principle. And it's more like we're just beneficiaries of it. And what his, changing political ties might be because of the finances. Yeah, of course, that's natural. I'm expecting people to get corrupted. The more fame they get, the more power they get. I'm not expecting the inverse. So that's not necessarily surprising. Even if Bernie, for God's sake, even if Bernie Sanders was elected president tomorrow or whatever, I expect very few people to be able to withstand the pressure of fame and riches and glory. Like, it's not. These are forces that have brought down most people throughout history. So, I like the guy though, and I think most of his shows were funny, and he was good at making criticisms. So it's kind of sad that someone like that, who has a gift, obviously is not going to use it, let's say, neutrally, right? And when he's in front of other political forces or different types of political people, like But a lot of these guys too, the Comedy Central guys and other people who have been on major networks and then have had their own spin-off shows or whatever, it's like at some point most people tend to buckle. So it's almost like in your generation, who have been the great voices to listen to and for how long? And then you can kind of sort through all of history and pick certain voices and be like, well, they were reasonable for their time. But
I think with Jon Stewart too, because he's not involved with the Comedy Central anymore, and so he's with Apple TV now or something, or that's like the network that I think his show is normally released on. But it's way more objective, I believe, than the Daily Show would have been. And I think just because of the fact that he's not on like a major networking, payroll at this point. So I don't know. He's always been pretty critical about when people make weird decisions or asking pretty hard questions on his new show.
Well, let's talk about that, because I've been considering all the ramifications of what happened, and I would always get disappointed when I would hear, we're trying to get someone who's not Trump, or we're trying to get someone who's not Obama or something like that elected, and they'll say jokes that benefit the candidate they like. So that is almost like a human trait to do that. But when they actually criticize the people that they like, to me that shows that they are an equal offender or an equal insulter of everyone. So then it's like, okay, they are being objective. But he has a tendency to have some, like, a little too much respect for the Clintons and very little respect towards Obama. If you ever watch his old interviews of Bill Clinton, he was like salivating over him and making him look good. And then Obama, he was calling him dude, and he was like being kind of disrespectful. And there's some people say that he has some racial bias or something like that. But another comedian was saying that the Clintons must have something on Jon Stewart, because he turns into a puppy when they come around. And the issue that no one has thought about is that with the whole woke and cancel culture, maybe he, as much of a rebel that he claims he is, he's walking on eggshells when he has two powerful women in front of him. Because if he were to challenge Clinton, all the Clinton fans are gonna say, "Oh, he's a sexist pig," and then if he were to challenge Condi, they would say, "Oh, he's a racist, anti-conservative." So he now has to play the same game that we've all fallen trap into, is the politically correct game. So now he could do anything he wants because he's a millionaire, because Apple came to him, because he has the clout and the ability to have, if he loses his show, he doesn't lose anything because he's already proven that he's good. So why would he not challenge them and not upset them? And he would even become more viral if Condi and Clinton walked out of the interview. But instead, he's now the appeaser and the one who's trying to make sure that their legacy gets respected and that other women get a foot in the door thanks to the sacrifices of Hillary and Condi. And to me, that just shows that maybe it's not money what corrupted him, but his stupidity, is the desire to want to change the world for better, but giving up all his values and his ability to make a difference for the sake of what are people going to say about me if I go too hard on these two ladies.
Yeah. Have you seen many of his episodes from his new show?
I've tried. When he first started, it was just him and a bunch of producers or assistants, and they would talk about random stuff. And I was like, whatever, I don't know who these people are. And
Right.
then he did a really good one on racism and a really good one about media bias or media the limitations of modern media. And that's the thing, is that both him and Colbert used to be funny because they were poignant and they were satirical and ironic and stuff like that. And now they're both tame. Like I guess when they get older, they say, well, maybe I was a little too harsh on people. And it's almost like the interview. I don't know if you guys seen the interview between Howard Stern and what's the guy, Bill Maher. It's like having two old ladies discuss, how to make the world a better place. Like one is
interesting. Right?
The guy that used to have women have sex on his show now is talking about how he went to a therapist and he learned so much about himself and how he can be better towards his family. And the other guy is talking about how much he loves musicals. And I'm like, what the heck happened to these two, hardcore guys? And it's because they're getting old and they're tired of being known as the troublemakers. So now they want to be everybody's dad and everybody's grandma. And I'm afraid that that's how Colbert and Stewart kind of sold out, that they can only pick so many fights. So maybe they're tired and they're like, well, it's better to have a foot in the door and sit in the table than to always be screaming from the outside.
Yeah, I don't know. I still disagree with some of that. I think if you watch a lot of the interviews he's done during this era of Jon Stewart's new show, I mean, he's very critical about a lot of people. He's a lot more serious than he was on the Daily Show. He still makes a lot of jokes and stuff with like his assistants, like what you mentioned. But it's always he does usually ask a lot of hard questions. Like I said, I haven't seen this Hillary Clinton episode, and it sounds like it might be pretty disappointing. But then Bill Maher too, he's another interesting person because he's had a lot of criticism from, all sides, saying things that aren't politically correct. And I don't know, he'll ask some pretty straightforward, hard questions to people too. And I don't know, I don't think there's as much kind of bias, or I don't think they've bent over as much as kind of what you say. Have you seen much of Bill Maher's show too?
I watch it every week, and I've had debates with Joe's other friend about Joe Rogan, and it's interesting that there's this guy who has a podcast, and he takes everything that Joe Rogan says and he actually analyzes it, and he did that for the episode that Bill Maher was there. And if you really think through and you investigate the claims that these guys make, they're actually not that clever. Like, they come across as very confident and very clever and very knowledgeable about all subjects. But if you actually break down the things that they're saying, they're actually buffoons in the sense of it doesn't even make sense logically. So I think what comedians have is this ability to have some bravado and some type of power in their voice, but and you almost like they're critical, but they're critical in a kind of making fun and goofing off way. So it's easy to go along, but then if you actually take the time to be like, wait a second, they just said something that doesn't work out in real life, and they always go to the most basic level. So I've heard Bill Maher say, men are only as faithful as they're allowed to be, and women should not be wild like men, because you can't have just both be wild. And it's like, logically what he's saying doesn't make any sense, but it's funny because that's how most people think. Like, it is the first thing that will come to mind, but then if you really think about it, it's like, wait a second, there's more to this. So they have answers for everything, and that's really the problem, is that's why someone like Trump can be so good at getting people to love him, because he's so quick-witted and so able to humiliate people in a second and show their flaws. then he becomes the king of the event. He's the spirit of the party. Even if he has nothing to share, nothing that is worthwhile, he has the ability to keep everybody engaged and involved. So I wonder if Jon Stewart wasn't given the chance to do his thing. But the one thing that I don't like about him, Bill Maher, and the new guy Jimmy Dore, is that they're really good at criticizing other people, but they're really bad at criticizing themselves. So
Yeah.
I can take every Star Wars movie and shred it to pieces, but I've never made a movie. So it's almost like the biggest issue in the art world is that critics have no clue what they're talking about because they've never done art themselves. So it's really easy to come and poop on somebody else's parade, but when it all comes down to it, until you've actually done politics, until you actually have tried to push bills and stuff like that. So that's where Condi and Hillary had the upper hand with John. John was able to assist the 9/11 survivors, but they can say, well, we have 30, 40 years of experience working with super difficult people, and look at us now. You're just a clown that asks questions. So maybe he was intimidated. Maybe he was kind of put in a situation where I'm not going to allow you to take over the conversation, because that's the other thing that people don't think about. When you're talking to an expert debater, you might be the greatest comedian in the whole world, but if the other person knows how to take over the conversation, you might not be able to get the right questions in.
I mean, you kind of said it too. Like, I mean, both those guys, Bill Maher and Jon Stewart, they're comedians first before anything else, really. And they're wealthy ones too. And they've both got long careers doing comedy. So, like you kind of said, they're there as comics, and they just happen to have maybe easier access to talk to some of these people. But yeah, maybe they don't have, they don't always have the same vocabulary to play the same game as, like, whatever, someone like Hillary Clinton, or someone who's been in politics for 30, 40, 50 years or whatever.
What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, a comedian's role is fundamentally different than a politician's. So that's the thing. And when it goes to Sam and talk about Joe Rogan, that's probably why Sam likes Joe Rogan's, because he's a comedian. So, like, there's a phrase that Sam would say, a comedian's job is to bring out insights, right? And whenever we laugh, it's because there's something true about it. And to your point, it tends to be making fun of what's most basic or lowest common denominators in society or in human nature that we all kind of get, but we don't always talk about or discuss or express. So that a comedian's job is to bring out the obvious and to put it in your face, and then make you realize that it's all kind of silly. Or if it's not silly, that you can at least laugh about it to try to get through it, right? Because it's working through the human condition from a different perspective. And I don't watch these shows, so I don't know. Like Bill Maher, I always liked Bill Maher because I thought he was relatively unbiased in a lot of things. He'd bring in a panel with, conservative, liberal, and like a moderate guy, and then just try to flay all of them. And it was like, that's impressive. Like he's able to sort of read into what they're saying enough and bring up counterpoints enough to have an interesting discussion. And I think that's part of the difference, right? Is like, I don't know even where I'm going with this, but like part of it is like, are you having a political discussion? And when we're having political discourse or talking about major issues, is it a discussion in which things are mutually understood and you can explore a topic? Or is it just picking fun at characters or flaws or blah, blah, blah? So like, yeah, I'd be interested to see how their shows are going now and what their approach is. I don't know. I mean, what you said made me think the opposite of what you were saying. Maybe like some people, they get so much money or they get in a position where everything's going their way in life, so they just say, screw it, I'm now, like, kind of like you said, the pressure's off, so I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. And that can be more laid back, telling dad jokes, or it can be like, I'm really going to press hard on people because no one can touch me. So it just kind of depends, I think, on the character, and the personality and stuff. But yeah, because like, who's the young black guy that is on
The Daily Show?
For the Daily Show?
Yeah, Trevor Noah.
I thought he was really funny at first, and then later it became completely obvious that he's totally a liberal, and like everything he's saying was like very, pretty much just pro-liberal, and it was like, okay, well, he's playing his hand, so that's fine. But like, I know you and I have talked about the very conservative guys too, and some of the mistakes that they've made. And Joe Rogan's obviously a buddy with what's his name, the most popular conservative guy, talk show host.
Oh, Shapiro?
Yeah, the big guy who kind of gets belligerent and he's emotional.
Oh, Jones,
yeah. Which is another thing, right? It's just like he just brings a different perspective and has a different personality, so people tend to gravitate towards him. I don't know where I'm going with that. I just kind of.
No, I just want to say for our audience, last time I had you and Sam on, you guys were defending Alex Jones' freedom of speech, and now he got totally slapped with $1 billion lawsuit that most people think is warranted. That if you're causing harm on victims and survivors and you are profiting from it, you should be charged all the money in the world, because what you gotta take into account is the emotional toll that it took on people while they're grieving, to have some crazy lunatic making suggestive like in obnoxious claims that he wasn't only attacking the government and the possibility of the government doing this. He was causing harm to individuals, not just ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Is the trial ended?
I haven't really been following up on it. I saw the first Sandy Hook trial, and it was interesting and intense. With the way that the defending attorney sent all of Alex Jones's like text messages and emails and whatever, all the Sandy Hook stuff, to the prosecuting attorney. And that, they had no idea that they had that information or whatever. So yeah, just a pretty interesting trial to watch. And yeah, I don't know. Alex Jones is just an interesting guy at this point. I liked, like I said, when he was, a long time ago, it was more like an entertainment thing. He's just like some conspiracy guy. But then, yeah, at what point is it just too far? And the Sandy Hook stuff, I think, is just that point. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's real. Like, there's a point at which you have to become responsible for your influence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like the discussion that they're having in the legal system is like, well, if you have 2 million Twitter followers and one of them happens to go kill somebody because of something that you said, you're not technically responsible for it, because it's not like it's a clear-cut case of you were directing somebody to go commit a crime.
Right.
However, how far...
But like...
Where's the line?
Should you take some sort of accountability for it? I mean, especially if you have such a major platform, like Alex Jones with his show, or like we were talking about earlier, like even like Jon Stewart, if Jon Stewart's saying a bunch of wild stuff on his show or something, like, and one of his followers goes and does something, yeah, you'd have to, you think that person should hold themselves accountable for saying something to influence that. But yeah, at what point, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. But maybe that's a better way to look at it, right? Like personal accountability. Because if you work for a major media outlet, you're going to be held responsible for every word that you say, whether that's, politically correct or not. And just like what David was saying in the beginning, like, who we're talking about, Jon Stewart, right? Was kind of like whatever, but now he's like dancing around maybe difficult questions with liberals, maybe because this is now working for Apple and they have a different agenda, right? So like with Alex Jones, though, when you're on free public media like David is, you can say whatever the hell you want,
Right.
right. But to how far? So there's like this corporate structure, like the business structure. And I think one of the interesting things, maybe the mismark here for Jones and other guys, is they never got out of the mindset that it's not about them, or it's just about them, right? Like you get so invested in your persona that you blab whatever, and you lose sight of the fact like, oh, I do have 2 million people that are actually interested in hearing this, and that might be influenced by it. And it's about them. It's not just about me and my words that I like to use. So like then if you make that leap into accountability or responsibility, now you have to think of other people, and now you have to think about repercussions and word choices even more deeply, and not just like whether it's going to make me money or make me look stupid or me.
Yeah.
And that's part of the cult of personality, or that you create a persona and a media and a public persona. And this, people who are famous talk about this all the time. You have almost two split personalities, because one of them is your famous person and one of them is your private person, who you actually are. And this is why I think like maybe Jon Stewart and these other guys, they might just at a certain point just go, screw it, I'm just going to be myself and I don't care. But you also have to have the platform to be able to do that, and the padding of having enough money that if you do get a lawsuit, you can fight it. So sort of like interesting.
I think Jon Stewart's, that's kind of his position that he's in right now, and that's what I was kind of saying. Like when he was on the Daily Show, he's working for Comedy Central. Now, I don't know his contract or whatever, but I mean, he can basically say whatever he wants on his show. There's just funding coming from somewhere, and it's still just a podcast. So I don't know. Is it different with different types of media? I think it's a lot easier with podcasting in general to say whatever you want, as opposed to if you're going to be on NBC or Fox or Comedy Central or whatever. You're, like you guys were saying earlier, you're probably going to be expected to say certain things or please certain people or whatever. I think in Jon Stewart's show now, he's just he has his bias, just the same as Alex Jones with his show. Alex Jones has his bias, and so yeah. But there's a question I was just going to ask. Is so with mainstream news outlets, let's say MSNBC and Fox and CNN and whatever, because there's so much financial influence to whatever please a certain side or whatever, at what point is all the private or smaller media, like podcasting, at what point is podcasting become that too, or can that become the same thing?
Right. I think it totally can. Right. I think it's like you got to look at it as tiers, with every tier having like different influences or different characteristics, right? Because it's all these questions of scale and the technology itself, what it allows for, the access that you have to it. Some people who are And yeah, the podcasting thing is so great, and it's like given so much access and information to people who normally wouldn't have it. But it maybe if you started doing analysis of the podcasts themselves, you would see like just where biases lie. Maybe not as pronounced as everybody knows Fox News and MSNBC and stuff. But yeah, as soon as you throw money into the mix, it complicates it, right? And then it's like, then it becomes about influence and buying people off and contracts and what you agree to say and not say.
So with what we kind of came into this whole thing with was, David mentioned the end of journalism.
Oh, yeah.
Is the end of journalism kind of just like a bunch of cycles starting over and over and over? Like podcasting is, especially right when it became a thing, it's like it was totally free. You just do whatever you want. And now there's a lot of big corporations, Apple, for example, getting involved in podcasting. So like what you're saying, once money starts getting involved, is it just going to turn into the same thing as Fox News and MSNBC or whatever? And are those channels just going to die at some point, and then podcasting is going to take that place? And then when podcasting gets so big and takes over to a certain amount, is there going to be some other form of media to take the place of what podcasting was and so forth? I mean, so it's just kind of like cycles. Does it all just cycle?
Yeah.
So is there an end of journalism?
Yeah.
Or is it just a bunch of cycles, maybe?
Right, yeah.
I don't know.
This is a deep question, yeah.
That's a deep one.
It's down there. Yeah, I don't know. You'd have to ask the journalist. That would be better.
Right, yeah. Just a
question for somebody who's inside the industry. Or
well, I'm going to get
for a living.
a few $1 million and start a podcast of my own, financially driven, and ask very biased questions.
Great.
And yeah, then we'll figure it out.
Right. Absolutely. I think it's interesting just from like a technology perspective. If you think about like. Everyone would talk. You can think about your voice as a piece of technology, your mouth. Right? And then when writing came along, you had to introduce that. And now, over the centuries, most people in the world write. There's probably some stats that can prove me wrong. But, and then they invented the printing press and then the computer, and then it's all the means of communication. The ever widening access and expanse and then improvement of those tools allows for just a sort of a questioning of where that cycle is, or if there is a cycle, and then what it's going to look like. Because it's funny, if you look at like people were afraid of TVs are going to take over the world, and they pretty much have. But computers are going to take over the world and corrupt everybody, and they pretty much have. And now we have computers that are the size of a dot, and you can think about like nanotechnology and that type of thing, and quantum as being the next steps in that. But I still think there's a big middle ground, right? Like most people only have one TV and one computer in their house. Most people do not have podcasts. They consume media. They don't create it. Okay. And there's now, and this is, we could talk about monopolies. There's only maybe a dozen major, probably closer to 5 or 3 companies that own most of the media at least in the U.S. There's probably a dozen in the world. And you can see the pyramid being created based, and that's created by access to technology and use of that technology. And I think that's a big part of it. There's Apple, Amazon, right, that owns what's the one that Joe Rogan's podcast is on?
Is it Spotify?
Spotify, right?
Yeah.
I think Amazon owns Spotify now, if they haven't sold out. So they probably will. they're all in it, right? And then the highest level people rise up, and their voices get heard, like Joe Rogan. Will that spin off into a TV show? Will that spin off into something else? Who knows? But like, it could. Like, media's what we're talking about, Grant, here is big media.
Right. Yep. I love talking about all those bigs.
A lot of big
media.
What was the other one that came out the other night?
The big breakfast industry.
Big breakfast industry. Yeah, totally. But that's real. Like, I think the end of journalism is an interesting question, because it's the obvious thing that's asking is like, when is it ever going to stop? And I think you're more right that it's not going to stop, because people want free speech and they want to talk, and they will find means to do that.
Yeah.
But I think the other way to look at it is, what is the purpose of journalism? And is it to communicate information? Is it to just give a platform for free speech? Is it to tell the truth? Because if it's to tell the truth, then we're having a very different discussion.
Yeah.
So
I guess that is kind of more the concern that everybody has at this point. And I think that's why we're talking about this, is because it's hard to just, you can't just dive into, it seems like you can't just turn your TV on and just go to a news channel and just be like, oh, this is just the objective news for today, because it's all, there's so much bias. And so how do you got to spend time and look through it and do a bunch of investigating and figure out if it truly is as objective as what they claim it is, which it's probably usually not. And yeah, I don't know. There's so many layers to it. I don't know.
the objectivity police then will have to be created to enforce perfect objectivity.
Yes.
But that, and this is my take on it, is it's all in the novels and it's all in stories. Like 1984 and Brave New World, and you see how media, which are most ones that people know of, you see how media is used to manipulate entire societies. And that's the question that faces journalists, is like, well, what is our ultimate purpose here?
And is the real problem George Orwell?
Well, George was just a genius, but and a little bit nuts. He's kind of a nutty guy. Yeah,
but yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's very there's so many, and there's kind of a weird bias thing that I have. As I always say things all the time, like, "Wow, this is real 1984-ish" or something, because there's just so many little things or big things that seem like they're straight out of that book, or the beginnings of something straight out of 1984. Also Idiocracy. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie.
Yeah, I remember that one. But I think, to go back, that's the comedian's role also is to elucidate what the future is. Like, if we head down this path, this is what's going to happen. Because you and I have talked about this too, comedians are extremely smart, actually. Even though some of them are playing buffoons or can be stupid, right, and saying nonsensical things, sometimes they can be very insightful. Yeah. And be like, this is actually what's happening. Or this is what could happen. And I think same with George Orwell. It's it's not so much that this is where things inevitably will go, but this is what happens when you do journalism this way. And without critical thinking and context or other things.
Purely where it's something maybe just purely financially driven.
Yeah, or just totally at the service of the state, and the state becomes corrupt.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Right, because that's part of it too. Like David's example, right? Free public radio, but yet it's obviously biased against a particular candidate, which is completely going against the principles of what public radio is supposed to be. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Everybody has a bias, unfortunately. I think some people are just a lot better at seeing self-reflecting, self-reflection of understanding if you yourself have a bias, and how do you fight that, or how do you combat that, to maybe look at other viewpoints or whatever and try to come to a more objective conclusion about something, as opposed to just letting your bias completely take over and just kind of going with that, never questioning yourself. Always have to question yourself. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's all I got.
Okay. Oh yeah, journalism. Is it the end? I don't know. Once journalists stop questioning themselves, then maybe it'll be the end of journalism.
Yeah. So again, it's like, are the other journalists? It comes down to accountability on the journalists. Are they being objective? Can they determine whether or not they are being overly biased? And what is the reason? Is it a financial gain? Or can they just not come to that? Can they just not see that in themselves?
Wow, that's a whole nother. That'd be
It's another episode there.
That's another episode right there.
I think accountability is kind of the big flaw we have in our country with everything. Nobody wants to be held accountable for anything, it seems like. So when you have people that clearly hold themselves accountable for things, those are usually the people that seem to be able to, they can be critical about themselves. And, yeah.